Well, all right.
So
Well,
I suppose we should
hello,
introduce
audience.
it.
we as the panel participants would like to note this recording will be a degree shorter than the allotted time. We have been waiting for the audience to filter in, and we consider that as much of the audience that will filter in has filtered in. And so we proceed from now. Hello, everyone. I'm one of the panel participants. I'm Patrick Neumann. Please call me Patty. I'm the chief scientist at Neumann Space. I work on plasma spacecraft propulsion systems.
Hi everyone, I'm Thomas Cullum. I used to work with Paddy at Neumann Space. I now work for BAE, but I've still got a keen passion for space, and in particular space traffic laws.
My name is Tom. I have a background in media. I was a traffic reporter a long time ago, but for the purposes of what I'm about to say next, these two gentlemen are terrible at spooking themselves. So Paddy here's got a Lawrence Sperry Medal behind him, and you're the president of the AIAA, is that right? In the South Australian chapter, Paddy?
Chair of the Adelaide section, yep.
Yep. And Tom Cullum here was shortlisted as Engineer of the Year for the Australian Space Awards last year as well. My name's Tom. I was, most relevant purposes of this presentation, I was a traffic reporter a very long time ago. And I'm a student at the University of Wollongong, and I look at practical ethics, media theory, and legal issues around new technologies. So that's what I do. And Trevor Sandlin can't join us. He might turn up later. He's an American. They're having Thanksgiving Day dinner over their time currently on the West Coast where he's based. And I think this year's Thanksgiving Day, regardless of what you think of Thanksgiving, I think this one is probably quite momentous, just given all the the pandemics have been having over there, and all the problems in America around the COVID outbreak. So I think this one probably means more than most this Thanksgiving Day. So that's why he's not able to join us. He did mention he might turn up for 15-20 minutes at some point. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, that's why he's not with us. But he did help put this together, and we do thank him for his hard work on that. Trevor is also a merchant marine officer in the United States Military Sealift Command, part of the Department of Defense Office of the Navy. He's currently XO of USNS Mercy, which is the hospital ship providing aid relief on the West Coast USA. So, but he's not here right now. He might come later. All righty. So acknowledgements to country. From Adelaide to Sydney to San Diego, we'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna, Darawal, and Kamieye country upon which we come together today, because obviously this has been done from different locations online. But more importantly, for the purposes of acknowledgement today, because there's been a lot of acknowledgement of countries on the land upon which people stand, is actually the stars we stand underneath. Because of course, the starscape has been a historic, very important part of cultural tradition and identity, how people see themselves against their lands, against each other. So that's look at space traffic management into going forward. It's probably also worth acknowledging that as well, the historical connection between country and star. So the journey so far, Patty, I'm sorry, I'll just move this. I'll move your thing here so you can read that. You want to kick us off, Patty?
Yeah, beauty. So I've been working with my esteemed members of the panel on various publications in this space before. And one of our earlier papers, as presented at the IAC in 2018, was looking at de facto rather than de jure monopolization through the use of large constellations of communications or other satellites. Because, as the quote says, the universe is infinite, but those volumes of it that are economically useful to humanity are not. Examples of this include the geosynchronous orbit band, where you have an orbital period equal to 1 day. So from the point of view of somebody standing on the Earth, that satellite appears to be fixed in space. This is quite an economically useful part of space, but it is comparatively tiny. If you are very tight in your definition, it is in fact one single altitude. The useful and practical part of this is every orbital slot for a satellite is a cube roughly 80 kilometers on a side. Your satellite has to remain in that one. There are various rules and regulations about this. This system has been working well, but those rules are in place to help prevent inadvertent disasters happening. Other orbits that are economically useful include the sun-synchronous orbits, which permit satellites to orbit much closer to the Earth at highly inclined orbits, so they go over the polar regions. But every time they orbit, as the Earth rotates below them, they pass over the ground at the same local time for that part of the orbit. So every time they cross the equator, it is 2
Can
p.m.
someone let Trevor in
local time.
quickly? I can't click that. Can you guys do that?
Done.
Okay.
So yeah,
Is he admitted?
these sun-synchronous orbits are quite useful for a bunch of applications: Earth observation, for weather, for mapping, resource management, forestry management, communications as well. These orbits, however, because they are useful, they are becoming more and more crowded. You have more entities putting more satellites into these orbits because they are useful. The guidelines and regulations are starting to catch up with this. However, you do have space traffic management issues. You do have problems that still need to be solved. Recent versions of this include such things as the Russian anti-satellite test of just last week, which put debris into the Earth observation band because that satellite was Earth observation intelligence satellite launched in 1982. So, in short, we put stuff in space to be useful. Of course, we as humanity will put that stuff where it is going to be of most use. And because a lot of the things we want to do are fairly similar, we wind up putting a lot of stuff fairly close to each other. That traffic has to be managed somehow. Back to you, Tom. And also, g'day, Trevor. Glad you joined us on this busy day in the US.
Hey, thank you, Patty.
Yeah. So I guess just sort of following on from Patty there, it's important to note that we're at this point in time, there's a lot of really new and a lot of interest, particularly in the commercial side of the space infrastructure development. We're seeing these very large low Earth orbit satellite constellations come into development, such as Starlink, OneWeb, and there's several others around, primarily from a telecommunications point of view, where being as close to the Earth as possible decreases latency and thus increases broad internet speed, if that's what you're trying to do. But there's also a lot of interest in low Earth orbit, as Patty mentioned, in Earth observation. There's scientific interest. It's naturally this place where the International Space Station is, and where a lot of other space stations are planned to be either in operation or used, because that's just the most accessible part. But it is also the area that is closest to the Earth, which means for the given volume that your orbital shell has, it's actually the smallest area you can really work with. As Patty said, space is infinite, but the useful parts of it are not. And so you have to be very careful with what we need to be more cognizant of. We're putting a lot of stuff in there. It's going to start getting busy. While we have managed in the past with a very ad hoc system where everyone just sort of chats to each other and says, hey, I can kind of see that there might be a collision in a couple of days' time. We should perhaps move one of our satellites and move out of that. That's not going to be sustainable, particularly as these large constellations start interacting with each other, where a more automated system, something that's a bit more scalable, is going to be needed in order to prevent potential accidents from occurring. If we go, so what we've basically done so far this year is we've looked at 3 particular areas we think are avenues for development where some sort of legislation could be generated from, either as one of these or a combination of all three, or just maybe one or two of them. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking through these three aspects that we reckon are good avenues for development into legislation to prevent, hopefully prevent future collisions that would damage these very important natural resources that we have. So if we go to the first one, which is going to be what we've called propellant liability, the idea behind this fundamentally comes down to the concept that if you've got two satellites about to hit each other, the one that has more fuel or is actually capable of moving should be the one to move. This was famously put to use or failed to be put to use in 2009 when the Iridium Cosmos collision occurred, in which the Cosmos satellite, being there before the Iridium one, argued that we don't have control over the satellite anymore. It's not able to be moved. We were here first, ergo Iridium, you need to move out of the way. And Iridium said no. And unfortunately, they ended up colliding, and has created a very large band of debris as a result in very interesting orbits that are rather useful.
Yeah, my rules cover that, rules I wrote.
Yeah, and we had another incident not too much closer to the time of recording in 2019 when ESA's Ariel, I forget, the pronunciation for that is terrible.
Aeolus, yeah,
Aeolus?
it's an Earth observation satellite, yeah.
So that's a scientific satellite. It was doing some Earth observation stuff, all good stuff. It's been on orbit for 9 months at this period of time. Starlink 44 had just changed its altitude in order to perform some maneuvering. As a result, it crossed into this orbit where they were going to collide. At the time, as it was found out, SpaceX didn't realize that there was going to be a potential collision alert. ESA attempted to get into contact with SpaceX in order to get them to move that satellite out of the way. Eventually, ESA moved on their behalf and then tweeted about it quite angrily at SpaceX, which created a bit of a controversy at the time, as that's perhaps not the best way of dealing with such a situation. Fortunately, nothing came of it, but it does show that this is something that is gonna happen more and more, especially as commercial interests start butting into or start being involved in low Earth orbit. We don't want to see companies getting competitive with one another and start being very macho with one another and deciding that they're not going to be the ones to blink. We can't play chicken with objects that are going several thousand kilometers per second. It's just not, several thousand meters per second. It's just going to end in tears for someone. So what do we want to suggest to do about this? Well, the idea again is the satellite that should move is the one that can move. This sort of gets around a bunch of things with space debris, where naturally space debris can't move. It's pretty stupid.
Not just can move, the pecking order of maneuverability. So whoever's most maneuverable moves, and whoever's least doesn't have to, down to the last, which is non-operational, like cannot maneuver. So there's a little, it's not just 1 or 0. There's some, less maneuverable, but still can move.
Yeah, and that's really important as well, because we've got a lot of CubeSats have become very popular for development in this decade. Most of them don't have a propulsion system, but most of them can orient themselves. So they can turn themselves in so that their broadest face is being affected by drag, and that can move out of the way. But obviously that's not as good a system as if there was let's take a Starlink, for instance, that's got an electric propulsion system on it that's quite capable. It can move relatively quickly. that those sorts of systems obviously should be used rather than a CubeSat having to drag itself down. There could be potential ethical issues about that, where if you did have a big constellation of CubeSats that formed in and are starting to cross into some important objects' orbits, does that then put the onus on those other satellites every time to move out of the way, or should there be some sort of discussion about how these are going to be resolved at the time? And that's something that is a problem we'll have to find a solution for, because the last thing we want to do is for having a big commercial super constellation or something like that, and then their commercial competitor puts a whole bunch of cheap, dirty satellites in those orbits deliberately to make use of those laws to force them to expend way more fuel than they need to artificially shorten the lifespan of that constellation. I don't see that happening anytime too soon, but that's certainly something that would be something we need to consider, and that's a real problem. How do we sort of deal with that? We had some ideas on other things we could do that surround this propellant liability. Forcing a mandatory deorbiting propellant budget, or some sort of plan for every satellite that goes up into, say, above 300 kilometers up, where the time it takes for that satellite to come down afterwards is something we need to consider. There's a lot of dead or nearly dead satellites that are up there that don't have a propulsion system. They sit in an orbit that's relatively high, and it means they're not going to deorbit naturally for over 25 years. The industry standard now has become, I believe, it's if your satellite's going to stay up there for more than 25 years, you need to have some sort of deorbiting plan, but nothing is being mandated. That's kind of just a rule of thumb or a guideline that industry has sort of picked up and is working with. Whether or not that's good enough is debatable. It might be well worth legislating something in the future that codifies that a bit more and makes that, you know, a more reasonable thing to do. You could probably tie that in with some benefits to the insurance that the satellites need to have on launch. Perhaps the government could potentially subsidize if there's been a plan for how, if your satellite has a plan of how it's going to come back down at end of life.
Speaking to the launch side of things there, Tom, there are a few jurisdictions that, while it's not codified in law, it's part of the regulations of which government entity you must get with to gain your launch license. That, in particular for second stages for launch vehicles, that they are placed in a sufficiently low orbit that they have quite a short lifetime. One example is the stages for geosynchronous transfer orbit. If you're putting a space in the orbit at 36,000 kilometers altitude, you tend to have a couple of bits of your rocket to actually get your satellite there. The Transtage used to be orbiting in a elliptical orbit where the lowest part of it was at about 400 or 500 kilometers altitude. Since in particular, American launches since a few years ago had their perigee, the closest part to the Earth, limited to about 200, so that their orbit degrade very quickly and come down, they burn up. It's not as well targeted as it could be, so there are cases of some junk landing and being documented. There's been one case of personal injury where a lady had a piece of space junk come through her room, hit her on the shoulder, and she got a bruise. There have been a few cases of damages to some orchards in California where the orchardist's almond trees got hit by a piece of junk. This is why we have insurance, of course.
Yep.
Skylab and Esperance is one of the classics. Thankfully, no real was caused, but the town of Esperance did give NASA a fine over this, which was eventually paid by a drive time radio show by subscription as part of a fundraiser. You know, we're money for the local children's hospital, I think it was, and to give us an excuse, we're going to pay NASA's littering fine of, I believe it was the largest one, Esperance levy, which in 1979 was, I believe, 200 Australian. So not a whole lot in the modern sense of things. It was the principle, and that's why NASA declined to pay the fine themselves, because that would have been a bidding liability, opening up precedents and all this jazz. But bringing it back to the orbit guidelines and on-orbit lifetimes, there are guidelines. There are various versions from the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, that filter through to various national bodies due to the treaty that forms the ITU. They get put into regulations for launch licenses, for spec licenses, for various things. It's not a law per se. It's more of a, can you check all these boxes? Otherwise, you don't get a license to go do cool things.
I'm just worried of the fact that obviously, Trevor, it's I know it's Thanksgiving where you are, so you can only do this for a short amount of time. Do you want to talk about? So Trevor actually put together part of the presentation some model legislation on ethical issues, which we were going to get to at the end of the presentation, but obviously I know time is short where you are, Trevor. Do you want to talk to give way notification for different types of class of satellites and that sort of thing quickly?
Sure. So I just got back from a mission. I'm trying to track my role here, but I'm trying to play a support role here for Patty and both Toms. Who's our audience right now? Who am I speaking with? Is this Chris? Are you?
Chris is currently the audience. It appears that
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Everyone
Chris.
else has thought the other talk session running in parallel was rather fascinating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Chris. Thank you for your time and for listening. I'll make it brief so I can get back to the U.S. holidays here. But yeah, I'm playing a support role for Patty and the Toms here. And so we're looking at legislation for these incidences so they don't reoccur. And it's essentially collision avoidance is what you want legislation for, but in space. So we already have that at a geographic level here, roadways. Then you have your ocean and inland and international ocean ways. And then you have your air, right? And the next thing after that, we need legislation for space. So the closest thing is going to be what we have already in place for sea laws. So you have your inland laws, and then after 12 nautical miles out, you start your international laws. And then those are developed by an International Maritime Organization. So same thing would happen in space. An International Space Organization would legislate and put in place navigational rules and regulations for space. And there are rules, like a couple rules in the beginning that, hey, nothing in these rules exonerates you, the owner, the vessel, the crew, the operator from any responsibility. And you have a couple of those, and then you get into the nitty-gritty of the rules. The rules are, and you go into things like, hey, you need to display different types of identifiers or sensors, have sensors running depending on how beefy of a spacecraft you are. So if you're something as small and maybe outdated or complacent, something in orbit with no propellant or anything, maybe you show up on radar, you have a radar reflector on you, or you have some kind of small, just an RFID or some low transmitting something, so that you can be tracked by a network. The network would be like an automated information system. It's what ships use to track all the ships in the world and buoys. And then anyone could view that network on a computer, on another system, on another spacecraft, and you can see where things are anyways. sensors on board spacecrafts, depending on what sensors you have, would take an aggregate of the information that the sensors are picking up, whether it's radar, 4G, 3G, LiDAR, or just whatever your sensors pick up. And then they take an aggregate, throw out the outliers, and then come up with a information for collision avoidance system. And then either an operator can use that information to compute, hey, risk of collision exists, or an algorithm in a computer can come up with a risk of collision exists. Once risk of collision has been established, then there's a pecking order of what happens next. So we can take the cases that were just mentioned and we can play them against this set, but basically once risk of collision exists, somebody is the giveaway and somebody is the stand on. So if you're non-operable, you have no propellant or no propulsion means, you're going to be the bottom of that pecking list on who moves. If you're highly maneuverable, you're going to be at the top of who moves. If you're in a meeting situation, so there's 3 different situations. You're either overtaking, you're crossing, or you're meeting both of you head on. And there's different rules for that, and I've outlined them in the rules. But basically, if you follow the rules, it makes risk of collision go away, and then you no longer have the risk. But so again, somebody's a burdened spacecraft to give way, and somebody's the stand-on spacecraft. And if they stand on, they have to stand on. The rules are outlined. Tom can expand on them and answer questions, but I think they check out for the most part. There's obviously some editing that can happen from people that are more familiar with space than me, like Patty or Tom, but it seems to work with those examples that you guys brought up earlier. And it seems to, if they had been in place, it would have stopped the incident. Just the one incident you're talking about who's to blame and saying they couldn't move, it would have covered those and then that situation. Anyways, do you guys want me to answer anything shortly on the rules? There's 16 rules right now, basically, and I'd love to answer any quick questions if there's anything you want me to add, Tom.
Yeah, I think it's all good, Trevor. I haven't put the rules in the slide deck here. So I think what we might do is, the plan's going to be obviously this. We'll put together a working group, probably just the 4 of us for now, I guess. And we'll just start hammering those out more, and we'll see what we can do with those in terms of policy framework, maybe presentation at a future conference. We'll definitely look more at the roadmap. But I guess the purposes of what we're doing here, it's definitely interesting. The collision risk avoidance you had there was very strong. I'm just bringing the talking points. I'm sure I'm sharing the presentation slide now.
I'm just going to hit the wave tops here a little bit. Basically, risk of collision has to be deemed to exist for the rules to take effect. Once risk of collision is determined, then the rules go in order. There's things in there about identifying what class of vessel you're in, spacecraft that you're in. So, for instance, a spacecraft underway, or a spacecraft that's locked in orbit, or a spacecraft that is restricted in her maneuverability due to the nature of her work, a spacecraft collecting data or scientific information, and then a spacecraft, lastly, non-operable or not under command. So depending on what you fall, there's a pecking order of who moves for what. And the idea is that no spacecraft gets left out for some kind of designation. Either it's non-operable, not under command, or it is locked in orbit, restricted in her maneuverability due to the nature of her work, or it's constrained by her size. Because I'm thinking future, large, huge space, like Star Wars types craft coming into an orbit where it's timed, it has to come in at a certain time so satellites don't hit it and whatnot. And so that spacecraft would be constrained by her size. Then there's a spacecraft that is underway and maneuverable, and basically you follow the rules. If you're tasked to move, you move, and if not, there's a collision, then space lawyers come after you, and that's pretty much how it would work out. Okay, well, thanks, Tom. Thank you, Patty. Nice meeting you guys. Nice meeting you, Tom. Thank you for your time. I'll see you guys later.
Catch you around, mate. Have a good one.
All right, thanks,
That's
Trevor.
just-
Enjoy your break.
All right, late.
So I guess sort of coming back to propellant liability as well. One thing we had sort of considered is it might be we might want to have something that's akin to what we have with the water market around farmers and their water allocations and that sort of thing. But in the terms of spacecraft, it would be some sort of fuel allocation. When you launch your satellite, you get a certain number of fuel credits that come off of that that you can then use when you're discussing with other satellites. Like perhaps we've got the obvious thing of there's a observation satellite. It's quite maneuverable, but it's in the middle of operation at the moment when the collision's about to occur. It might be that you negotiate with the other satellite operator that they'll move instead, bypassing that or changing up who actually gives away there in exchange for passing over some of those fuel credits to the other satellites, so they could potentially call in the favor later down the line and say, well, we were the good citizen before at this time. We've got these credits coming from that. We're now operating and we really don't want to move at this particular point in time. We'll trade in those credits to mean they've got the right of way or something like that. It's just an idea that might be useful to sort of handle special case situations. It also gives some incentive for satellite operators to actually launch their spacecraft with a decent amount of propellant in it, not just enough to maintain its on-orbit lifespan.
This one will require satellite owner operators to communicate more about their spacecraft than they tend to do, because if I just let everyone know how much Delta V I've got on board, how much maneuver authority I actually have, then people can start thinking about how big the rest of the subsystems are on my spacecraft, given that most of the time people have some nice little pictures in the media of their new satellite during final integration being bolted onto the top of the rocket and up goes a satellite. If you tell people that you've got this much authority and what propulsion system you got, people can then work backwards to have a think about how big X must be, what your capabilities might be. The requirements for this are not big. If you have to do or you're required to meet a deorbit guideline, you're going to have a certain amount of propellant on board, plus margin for unexpected emergencies, safety margin, degradation of your system over time, etc., etc., etc. So while this is one counterpoint, we don't consider it to be a particularly valid one. We don't consider it a showstopper, simply because of you're not telling people very much. And if everyone says it, you're not actually putting yourself at a disadvantage. People doing it voluntarily might put themselves at disadvantage. However, quite a lot of this information for satellites launched from US and by US entities has to be disclosed to the FAA and the FCC as part of their launch and spectrum license applications. If you want to have a bit of an idea about how much maneuver authority SpaceX Starlink satellites as an absolute minimum, you can go and look at the publicly available FCC and FAA license applications, and using some of the standard equations in the field, work backwards to figure out how big their tank is, having a rough estimate of the mass of the satellite, and knowing from publicly available sources that they use a Krypton-fueled Hall effect thruster as their propulsion system.
Yeah, and that's going to be perhaps the big ethical and the difficult question about any kind of legislation around this is, how do you incentivize commercial entities who are going to become the dominant operators in space? That's pretty much happened in the past 2 or 3 years with Starlink alone. They've taken over as like most of the operating satellites on orbit at the moment now, just purely because it's so big. And it's only one.
They're taking over other people's, not by taking over other people's satellites or destroying other people's satellites, just launching so many of their own.
Yeah,
and the other issue too. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, and the debate will then become, how do you incentivize these companies to act in good faith and be good, conscientious operators in space, but not make it so economically disadvantaged to them that they actively don't want to do it, and they'll just do the bare minimum.
Now, the other issue too, of course, is that, you know, historically, part of the problem is the rules are very simplistic, and in terms of how they're informally arising. So, I mean, if you think in terms of like a common law tradition, like a customary tradition, what we have so far in space, these two incidents from 2007, 2019, about 12 years apart, Iridium Cosmos collision, the Russians, so the Cosmos satellite was dead, and the Russians said it was Iridium's fault because their satellite had power, so they should have moved out of the way, because the Cosmos had been up there for longer, and they're like, well, you know, it was there, you didn't move, so you get our dead satellite, it is what it is. Which sounds kind of okay until you think about, as a comparison, it would be like me saying, so I got a highway on some of my building here. If I left a pallet of bricks on the highway because I was doing some construction, like maybe I'm fixing my garden, I want to put some tile down. So I leave a pallet of bricks on the highway and a car hits it. It'd be like me saying to the motorist of the totaled vehicle, well, you know, that pile of bricks, it couldn't move. You had a steering wheel. You should have driven around the side. It is what it is. It was the bricks were there first, you know, tough luck. And when you realize what you're facing in terms of, you know, argument, in terms of logic, critical thinking, this is where philosophy comes in, really. You realize that rule doesn't make a great deal of sense. Similarly, in 2019, the European Space Agency's Aeolus satellite was in that orbit first. And Starlink 44 dropped down to the same orbit to do some maneuvers to test out emergency systems. And ESA said, hey, could you please move? You're in our orbit. We were here first. And Starlink 44, the Starlink guy said, yeah, no, we're doing some tests, which we need to do for our constellation satellite. So tough luck, just move out of our way, please. And the European Space Agency did, of course. So in both of these instances, I guess in terms of the court of popular opinion, the American satellite companies came out looking like the losers. They looked like the bad guys. And Iridium was like, it was your fault you hit that satellite. And in Starlink, it's your fault you made the Europeans move. There's a lot of love loss in terms of academia for American commerce. That's true. But if you extrapolate that rule and think about what that would look like in 20 years, if we follow the approach of I was here first, so, you know, you have to put up and shut up. When you've got 12,000 satellites from Starlink up there, that's going to mean that new operators coming into market, so developing countries, new companies moving into space, different actors, they're going to have to follow that rule of, you know, Starlink was there first, so you have to put up with what they've got. And this will act as a barrier to entry to new markets emerging and new actors emerging in space, which may not ethically be what you want, because what you're doing is you're creating a monopoly, essentially, by organizations and institutions and countries that got to space first, essentially. So part of the rules in terms of maneuverability really has to move beyond the I was here first, which is a very high school approach to resolving problems, particularly when it deals with, you know, active orbits that can have serious consequences. So,
and this kind of ties into actually the next section we're going to talk about, which we've labeled as axial shift. And what this really is talking about is, you know, space. You've got these objects moving very fast. It's probably a good idea to have a plan as to where to move them to. Once you have decided you're going to need to move your satellite out of the way, you don't want to accidentally dodge one satellite and then hit another satellite because you've just moved out of the way of one. So we need to start thinking about, if we are going to create this sort of ecosystem or this set of laws that are fair and, you know, enable us to operate safely, do we need to have some sort of provisions for, much like geostationary orbit, do we need to have slots in low Earth orbit? Do we need to have slots in sun synchronous orbit? How does that get managed? Because yeah, as Tom said, we don't want a situation where Australia or potentially India is up and coming space power. And there's several African countries that are seriously now looking at and into developing their space agencies. They're going to need some way of getting into it. They would, under the current legislation with geostationary satellites, they're entitled to a certain number of slots in the geostationary band above Africa, so they can make use of that resource. How do we want to approach that when it comes to something like low Earth orbit or sun synchronous, where it covers every country? When you're operating in those orbits, how do you equitably divide that between the parties here? What do you need to put aside for government use? What do you need to put aside for commercial use so that can be developed? What if you want a particularly special use? Like the International Space Station is a fantastic example of this, which is a multinational approach to it. How does something like that get involved into it? And how do you divide that in some sort of equitable way? But also, how do you make that safe? One idea we sort of had was you might actually want to start thinking about making specific orbital shells safe areas for dodging satellites. It's a very brute force approach to it. It's like us having a 12-lane highway and saying every second highway or every third highway lane you might want to have open as that's the emergency lane for ambulances or cars or trucks out of control. So something similar to that. Do you want to start breaking up low Earth orbit into these sort of bands where every, 10 kilometers up, for instance, do you have a particular area that's designated as this is a dodge area for the neighboring bands? That works great for circular orbiting satellites, which the vast majority of them are in low Earth orbit. But that's not to say that there aren't satellites that have highly eccentric orbits. The ones that spring to mind is the Russian positioning satellites, which Paddy, you might be able to help me with this. The
GLONASS.
GLONASS. So they operate because Russia is in a very
GLONASS.
So because Russia is in a very high elevate latitude, or was it longitude? I forget. Latitude. So
they also have longitude as well because they're two-dimensional. Yeah, but
it makes it very difficult for GPS.
There's length and breadth to Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes it very difficult for current GPS satellites to operate with Russia because it is in that extreme area, getting the fine precision that we're used to for using our mobile phones to navigate around. The accuracy kind of peters off there because it's a bit tricky to triangulate at that particular point. So Russia was like, well, we'll build our own GPS for that particular reason. They operate in these very eccentric orbits where they hover above Russia in sort of like this pseudo geostationary sort of thing for them, but they have a couple of satellites to maintain that. But these satellites are these massive orbital bands that go between low Earth orbit and then quite high up into the medium Earth orbit, I believe. And we're going to have, because space is three-dimensional, giveaway is a great way to start, but then how do you tell people where to go when you're giving way? You're constantly moving. Your options for maneuvering are limited. And you're going to have to work out these sort of interesting edge cases where the trajectory work is definitely non-straightforward in suggesting what's going to be the best way to do it.
Similarly, you've got the emergency lane, the shifting lane is a great plan. However, you then have to make sure it stays clean. There will be different requirements based around debris forming from collisions, debris from usual just natural microgrid applications, plus there's perturbations placed in all satellites. So if you do have a satellite that does not require propulsion in order to do its job, or it's just run out of propulsion, but it's still, you can still communicate with it, it will have perturbations put on it by the tiny amount of atmosphere that still exists out there as atmospheric drag. You'll have the gravitational tugs of the sun, the moon, and all of the other bodies in the solar system gently tug it out of its assigned orbit, plus radiation pressure from sunlight and particle pressure from the solar wind, increasing the orbit's eccentricity in a way as to make it stream out backwards away from the sun. So even if you put it in a very circular orbit, unless you're able to maintain that, it becomes sufficiently eccentric over time. The satellite could become sufficiently eccentric over time that it would interfere with this safe dodging space. In which case we come back to other questions such as what we do with a non-responsive debris. Whose problem is this? Manage this? Is it a case of it's all too hard to do a general case and we approach it with a general guideline that gets acted on via national licensing authorities, much in the same way we do today as a practical way of approaching solutions to this problem? Do we have a United Nations resolution, which, like a lot of other United Nations resolutions, people sometimes say no to? What do we do? How do we solve this? These are questions.
Yeah. And how do you... Oh, sorry. Do you want to go, Tom?
No, yeah, I was just going to say just quickly. So I just dragged this, sorry, botching the slide deck here. I just wanted to bring this up here quickly. So one of the things in terms of road design, so obviously internal combustion engine, Otto von Diesel, that's the 1880s, 1890s, Model T Ford about 1910 or so starts being mass produced. For the first part of the 20th century, really, the first part of the first 50 years of us having vehicles, we've had vehicles now, internal combustion vehicles, on a commercially affordable basis for just over a century now. The first 50 years of that story was really trying to figure out how to make the roads, design the roads in such a way that you could put as many lanes as you could on those roads and make those roads as fast as you possibly could. That was the first 50 years. And we saw a correlation of doing that and road crashes and deaths. I think by the 1920s, we had something like 5,000 or 6,000 deaths per annum here in Australia, and I think the US had about 20 or 30,000. And we've been trying now for about years to go. Well, we have a strategy at Transport New South Wales where I currently work called Towards Zero. So the idea is, aiming to get to 0 deaths on our roads. And part of that has been achieved through our new road design. So modern roads aren't designed like the old ones. The old ones had absolutely no shoulder. It was just packed in as many lanes as you possibly could, and it was a straight run. Modern roads, we have traffic calming strategies. This could be anything from a chicane or a speed bump. We now have smart speed bumps, rumble strips. We utilize curvature of basically the topography to assist with reducing speed. Other things we do on highways, this is just courtesy of Wikipedia, but the principle applies for Australian roads as well, is we now try and not so much increase the amount of lane capacity, but increase the amount of area you can decelerate safely in without colliding with another object. So as you can see here, this patch of road, you've got 2 lanes. It's a dual carriageway, so 2 lanes here and 2 lanes over there. You can see that in the distance. But in between, as you can see, you've got your shoulder of the road here, but then you have this deceleration area as well. So if you lost control of your vehicle, maybe there's a bit of oil on the road, maybe your tire blew, maybe you were, there was a collision avoidance, someone up ahead was driving unsafely, you need to pull out and
maybe
decelerate.
there's a pile of bricks.
Yeah, I left a pile of bricks on the highway. Exactly. I left Tom being inspired by the Russian Federation, left a pile of bricks on the highway. You have an area you can essentially decelerate in quite safely, or relatively safely. There's no trees here. There's no buildings, as you can see. There's not additional lanes. You can see here very cleverly. I really like this. It's a really great feature here. They've got a little rumble strip built into the actual asphalt, which is a really great detection and verification for road safety as well. So what we're proposing, I guess, would be, the first 50 odd so years. I mean, so Sputnik goes up in 57. The first 50, 60 years, we've been really focused on trying to figure out how to pack as many satellites as we possibly can up into orbit. And I guess the approach that we're thinking here would be best, and this is, again, a philosophical exercise, I suppose, is rather than trying to figure out how to pack in as many satellites and as many lanes as we can, it's rather how to provide safer spaces that you can actually move satellite into to avoid a collision. Similarly here too, you see this with trucks. This is, again, from Wikipedia. This is a road in Germany, but you'll find these pits. Essentially, they're essentially ramps provided for trucks, so they can safely decelerate. So if there's an issue with their load, or if there's some sort of uncontrolled movement for any reason, they can peel off from conventional traffic and decelerate safely into a patch. Similarly with satellites as well, not so much deceleration purposes, but having a safe area in certain orbits where satellites can move into and move out of, where required to avoid collision risks with other satellites and space debris as well, would be advisable. It does mean, of course, you end up using less of your orbit for satellites, but it means you end up, in theory at least, using it more efficiently. And reducing collision risk, of course, has a long-term benefit because it means you'll have less debris, which means you can, if you play the long game, you actually kind of using more of space going forward. So that's basically what these two images here to represent. Obviously, as Tom did mention, this is three-dimensional space we're looking at, so the rules are a little bit different. It's not quite the same as clearing vegetation and establishing earthworks to allow for those pits for vehicles to safely decelerate. It is a bit more complex than that, but the principles remain relatively the same.
Yeah, and the other thing that's different is with roadworks, you can pause traffic going down that highway and then do construction work on it to make it better. You can't do that in space. There's no way of saying, oh no, space debris, stop there. We're going to reorganize everything and then you'll come through. No, it's been constantly updated. There's no real way to delineate things at the moment. One big issue, if we are going to implement these sort of safety nets, is there is already a bunch of active satellites on orbit that were designed and placed up there specifically without these rules in mind. And there's an ethical consideration we have to make, which is what happens if there's a commercial satellite or scientific satellite that finds itself operating in where it's designed to be is now being declared a accident safety area, and they now have to move. Well, what if their optical sensors are specifically designed for that particular altitude, or their comm systems are designed around that? It's not necessarily fair to expect that. So we would have to sort of do some sort of transition over time, probably even some debris removal over that span to clear up some of these areas specifically. These are real issues.
Yeah, sorry, I just moved to the next slide there quickly, Tom. I should have probably asked if you wanted me to do that, because you just touched on priority orbits.
Yes, and that was quite deliberate. Because
okay, great. That was like a subtle prompt.
Yes.
All right, I'll play that again then. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. So this is a classic example of why you might not want to interrupt a particular satellite. As everyone's probably aware, there was some very awful bushfires that came through last summer. As a result, we did actually get some satellite help, as you can see here, where we were able to take a look and see where the active fire zones were when they're not being occluded by smoke. So we can more accurately send firefighters to deal with the blazes that were most pressing. We had a very clear idea of what we needed to do and where we should concentrate our efforts. Obviously, a satellite doing that in an emergency situation. There have been other areas where Iridium satellites have been used as emergency communication after natural disasters. And there is a growing presence on orbit now for this kind of emergency infrastructure that is there. And we need to take that into consideration. We're obviously going, like when we do start figuring out some sort of giveaways, as Trevor alluded to, we can do a giveaway based on propulsion capability and maneuverability. We probably should also consider a giveaway system based on function as well. We might want to, for like GPS, these emergency equipment, we might want to give them the right of way most of the time. Then perhaps we want scientific payloads, perhaps might be the next one down the list, and then commercial, and then so on and so forth. In order to work out, in a given situation, is a satellite needing to move, or should it be left alone if it's doing something quite important? An example of where this might be relevant in a non-emergency situation is with synthetic aperture radar imaging, where you have your satellite on a known course, it's going in a straight line, and it needs to maintain that, and it has to know where it's going so it can accurately do that imaging. So you get these incredibly accurate height maps of what it's imaging, which can be incredibly useful for planning, but not necessarily for emergency work. How does that sort of come into this? If you're doing another very good example that's coming up is the James Webb Telescope. Admittedly, that's not going to be in a highly trafficked area, but the Hubble is in a more trafficked area. The Hubble has to point very accurately for a very long period of time in order to get its fantastic photos. But does that mean if an emergency happened and the Hubble had to suddenly move, should the Hubble move out of the way? Should the emergency stuff move out of the way? Probably you'd let the emergency stuff do its own thing and Hubble can take a photo another time. But what if it's a commercial satellite? Let's say a Starlink crosses into Hubble's orbit or something similar to it. Is the precedence there to let the Hubble continue its scientific work, or should the commercial satellite get right of way? It's these sort of things that you might want to consider. Going the next step up from that, obviously most satellites are unmanned, but what do you do with manned spacecraft? Does the International Space Station get right of way everywhere it goes? And how does that sort of get bundled into it? If we're sending people to the moon or to a different low Earth orbit, back in the olden days with the space shuttle doing servicing missions, how does that sort of play into it, and where does the priority come there? And that's something we could perhaps add on to the fuel liability in order to work out, okay, this satellite can't maneuver as much, but it's a commercial satellite that is part of a very large constellation. It can be put offline and out of position briefly while this scientific payload is doing its job, or while the International Space Station flies past, and then it sort of comes in. And it's these sort of interplays between what we want to actually do. I think that's going to help create a very solid and robust framework for general use cases, and hopefully that would get us somewhere. You could, of course, do other things like we've talked about propulsion, its use. It could have specific orbits that are in there, like the Glasgow spacecraft. Maybe they should get right of way because they're in this very strange orbit and they need to maintain that. And that's not easy for them to get back into once they get out of it. So there's a lot to consider.
Yeah. So, Paddy, do you want to go, or do you want to talk?
No, I think Tom's covered it quite a lot. As Trevor was mentioning, there are some spacecraft that will be constrained to their orbit by dint of what they're doing. Tom's got some examples there. You can't really expect navigation satellites upon which national infrastructure and national and civil infrastructure is dependent to just, can you shift a couple 100 meters to the side? You can, she'll be right. No, that's not going to really work. For a bunch of other applications, it can be made to work. If it's a communications constellation in low Earth, you have redundancy at the constellation level. So if you have to move one of the satellites a little bit to the side and then wait till the hazard passes and then bring it back to the correct orbit, which might take a few orbits to get the phasing just right, then that's a lot more doable. Similarly, we saw the images from Himawari 8 of the various of bushfire images from previous summer. The Himawari 8 is in the geosynchronous band, which is one of the more well-regulated parts of space. There are, however, a bunch of other satellites in much lower orbits. If they were being tasked for something that is in the public good, the national good, it has a defense application, then you would more likely get a lot of pushback. What happens if no one wants to move and everyone is pushing back? How does this get managed? What happens if there's a collision? Does this look from a liability perspective? Do people have clauses inserted into their launch and frequency allocation agreements, or even their insurance agreements? That Lloyd's of London, Munich Re, Paris Re, all the insurers and reinsurers around the world would be very interested on this one. As an aside, a few years back, when it had one of its very, very rare launch anomalies, and piling on the pad did not go to plan, wound up burning on the pad, and I believe it was a Facebook and an Israeli satellite on board got toasted. That year, there were a couple of launch failures with the Soyuz launches as well, which I remember reading was the worst year on record for space insurance. Detailed records were kept by the global professionals. In that year, there was sufficient payout that the insurers lost several $100 million. If there's a requirement for space traffic management, and we're pretty sure there will be, and it makes sense for new objects launched to space to have into their insurance policies you will abide by the reasonable directions of this organization. Otherwise, when they're wrong, the insurance company is under no obligation to pay up. You might have caused $500 million US worth of damage. That's on you.
So there is a very strong economic and legal case for some sort of regulation of this. That just there's bits and pieces around, but it's not being, collated or put together in a coherent single point of legislation or something like that to or even just as guidelines for insurers to work by or operators to work by for this sort of thing. And it's something we're going to have to really look at now that space is getting very commercial. We're not suddenly going to say, well, we've done the space thing, we'll just come back down, we won't worry about it anymore. But space is going to continue to develop. There's a lot of interest in it now, and it is far better and much more in our interest to come up with some sort of guidelines or rules now while things are manageable, before we end up having mega constellations butt heads into each other and potentially hit that worst case scenario of a really nasty Kessler syndrome happening.
Yeah. But the issue too, in terms of what would even qualify as priority use, right? I mean, let's say you had a dust storm. So one of the things the European Space Agency has done recently is they've launched the Sentinel satellite constellation. So I think it's not much of a constellation. I think it's like 5 or 6 satellites, but the idea is to essentially monitor air quality. They've actually done some pretty good work. They started throwing those up in 2018. They've done some really great work on monitoring illegal CFC emissions that were coming out of industrial areas and able to clamp that down, which is pretty neat. tracking formaldehyde emissions as well, which has been wonderful for population health. Particularly in India, there was an issue of formaldehyde blowover from a factory there, which wasn't adhering to EPA guidelines there. But let's say, for example, you have a dust storm happening in Australia, like we have dust, say, coming up from the central part, and it's blanking the east coast. And you had let's say you had a satellite constellation doing air quality mapping and monitoring in real time for those areas. But at the same time, you had telecommunication satellites that were operating as well. And we're now living in a situation where we've moved away from terrestrial cell towers, like what I use for my iPhone, and we're all using satellite phones because it's cheaper. It's just better reception, better coverage. And this will gradually happen over the next 10, 15 years. How do you manage the telecommunications network while also maintaining monitoring? If you have a collision issue, like who takes priority? Because obviously telecommunication is important. People might want to talk to each other and say, hey, there's a dust storm coming in over Asthma. You might want to close windows, heads up, it's coming your way. People might have a fall at home that you call dial 000, get an ambulance there. There's a lot of practical reasons as to why people need to have access to telecommunications, which don't involve necessarily taking a selfie and putting it on Instagram. So how would you manage, the day-to-day telecommunication issues with, say, Earth observation from say a dust storm to might impact people with breathing issues, or alternatively have asthma or something like that who might be adversely affected? How would you manage that? These philosophical issues which don't have a clear-cut answer, I don't think, at least anyway. I think these require continued exploration from like practical ethics perspective. So I don't know. It's as Tom said, as we continue to figure out new applications for space and space telemetry and communication, I think these issues will become more and more complex as time goes on. It's kind of like the laser. If you think of space as an environment, but also as a technology, it's almost like the laser. When they invented the laser back in the 1950s, it's like 1953, 1955, something like that. There wasn't much use for a laser at that point. They kind of looked at it and thought, okay, it's a really concentrated beam of light. That's cool. But I mean, we've found so many applications for lasers, even in the last 20, 30 years. There's no way the people who invented the laser could have anticipated at that time. We use it from anything. Everything
one of the
from
famous
GPS
quotes
to cosmetics.
is one of the laser physicists in the early days was, "This is really great. It is a solution looking for a problem."
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. Yeah, and that's a way to think of space. It is a solution in many regards, looking for a problem to solve. I was watching Kamala Harris actually was talking to some people at JPL and NASA. Would have been, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I saw this. And she was talking about whether NASA could actually use their satellites to track tree levels in inner city communities to help with thermal dampening. So obviously trees, just by nature of how foliage works, it helps act as a heat sink. It reduces temperatures in urban environments, concrete jungle. You have a tree there, you see these microclimates tend to drop in terms of heat. And she was, VP. She didn't come with a brief. She just spoke, just top of mind. This is clearly something that she is aware of and has thought about. And said, hey, do you guys can you map trees so we can know how many trees we've got in inner city areas to help improve, the living conditions, the temperature resilience, that sort of thing of these environments. And that's something I never even thought of. In terms of foliage mapping. So there's a lot of solutions you can have for space. And I think as we go along, we'll find more and more problems that you can solve by space. And the question really is simply a matter of how do we negotiate that? How do we navigate that? So yeah, I think there's a lot there. And so yeah, we had propellant liability. This all kind of feeds into each other. You got propellant liability, who moves. Then you have axial shift liability, or where do you move to? And finally, you have priority use of orbits. Well, who doesn't have to move at all? Why are we moving? What are we going to lose if we move?
Yeah.
What's the outcome?
Yeah, and it's going to become one of the things I can think of as well. That priority becomes very interesting with, I think, from an ethical point of view, is space archaeology, which is something that is it's a thing that is developing now. And they are talking about, well, what are we going to do with the International Space Station at its end of life, which we're approaching. And there are different concepts. So they might go off to private companies that want to operate it by themselves for a little bit, break off, make new space stations out of that. But there are things like the Hubble Space Telescope that doesn't have a particular use after end of life. It's definitely an object of real historical significance. Do we want to give it a priority orbit as a result? Because it's not going to be able to move forever. Would there be an instance where we would say, well, we'll leave it be for a future generation to perhaps move it to a safer orbit that could then be preserved properly? There's some interesting discussion we could have there as well, but that's an example of where you might want to have a priority orbit with something that has no real purpose at the moment or no real function, but it's something to consider.
Yeah, so these are some of the ideas we've been kicking around here in our little working group. I mean, I guess if we had an audience, now would be the time for questions. We don't though, so but
unless Chris has got some questions.
Oh, we're getting applause from Chris. That's something.
Yay!
I do actually have a question.
Okay.
Well, this is all fascinating stuff, but I'm wondering if, to what extent is there buy-in from the relevant players or to these ideas, or is this very much early days of just sort of trying to work out possibilities and nothing? Is there anything set in stone in this space? Any movement?
Can I talk to that first? Would it be okay if I just spoke to that?
Yeah, I think you're the best person.
So the purpose, Chris, and it did not work at all. It did not work. This has been a total flop, of course. But the purpose of today's presentation was to inspire the next generation of philosophers. That was the idea, was to, one of the things that's really been lacking historically in space has been engagement with the philosophical community. And part of the reason why is also that philosophers, and I used to be a philosopher, or at least a philosophy student back in the day, so I do speak with some degree of expertise on this point. We don't do ourselves a great deal of credit. We do tend to flop around and discuss things that have been well tracked. We don't need another dissertation on Descartes looking at a very obscure little pettifogging point. These are the issues that are practical. They have real world consequences. Himawari 8 as a satellite, that did save lives. This has real meaningful consequences. And one of the things we wanted to do was to, and I've been doing these presentations. This is my third now with the Australian Association of History of Philosophy and Social Studies of Science. I'm on the exec as well, although probably not for much longer. But one of the things we really wanted to do was to help inspire and create a culture amongst philosophy of science students and researchers and academics to pick this up as a topic and champion it. Because I think it needs to be discussed, and we have space lawyers. We've had space lawyers now since at least 1957 when we introduced the space treaty. Those were lawyers who did that. So we've had space lawyers for a while. Sorry, 1967 out of space treaty, and we've had space engineers at least 1957 with Sputnik. So we've had both of those. We need the heart. We need the soul. We need people who can come in here and disentangle and play with the problem, think about it from different angles, anticipate issues before they arise. So in terms of policy development and next steps, that's basically what we're thinking is what we need now is more than anything else really is space philosophers. That's all I had to say on that point. It didn't work, of course. You're the only one here, Chris. I mean, maybe you'll become the space philosopher. That could be it. But that's all I wanted to say to that. But anyway, you want to talk there, Tom or Patty?
Yeah, so this is early days, yeah. Indeed. There is buy-in at various levels on trying to get space traffic movement and into play. It's been the initial is space situational awareness is the term of art in the field, where you're happening in space. You know where things are, you know what they're doing, you know what they're going. And the better we get at space situational awareness, the better fidelity we have for orbit and orbit modeling. So you've got more confidence on your satellite's location and everyone else's exact location, be it a satellite, a piece of natural debris, a fragmentation piece of shrapnel sort of thing. If you know where thing is plus or minus 1 kilometer, not so much useful. Plus or minus 100 meters, plus or minus 5 meters is a lot more handy, especially if your spacecraft is 5 meters across the solar panels, right? The better space situational awareness is getting, it has become very good these last couple of years with optical and wave interferometric radar coming online. So now we start getting in towards, we've got these many potential collisions per day. We now need to manage traffic. How do we do this without contravening parts of the treaties we've agreed on for a while, without needing to modify them, because that opens an entirely different can of worms. How do we try and make this work within the frameworks that we've got? And there are some ways of doing this. We've mentioned a couple today, but the various people at national agencies, be it for telecommunications, be it for space access and regulation, are well aware of the need for management. And people are starting to work on this as part of the Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Space, as well as the International Telecommunications Union, approaching it from 2 different ways. I do also note that very recently at the United Nations General Assembly, Committee Number 1 recently said, yes, we really should discuss more about this space debris and management issues. So that's probably also something that's going to be coming along in the next few years. So to answer your questions, yes, there's buy-in. Yes, it's today's. People are still having to think about what it should look like and how we're going to make it work, as well as the necessary enforcement side of things.
Yeah. Just the only other thing I've really got to touch in is that now that space is becoming a much more commercial got a much more commercial aspect to it. There's probably, I think there's going to be a lot more development from commercial and economic consequences if this isn't developed. I think we've sort of touched on that insurance that does go into spacecraft is ludicrously expensive. And if insurers will want to save money naturally, putting in some sort of framework that prevents operators under them to abide by a certain number of laws to minimize that risk, that's a win for the operators. It's at less risk from getting smacked into something. It might mean that they'll have lower insurance premiums. It means the insurance companies are happier because they don't have to, they've got lower risks to what they're effectively investing into there. And it's one of those things that it might be that because space is becoming commercialized, that this actually does become a serious thing that is looked at, partly from a regulatory point of view, but certainly from an economic one, I reckon, over time. Yeah. And the only other thing.
Sorry.
I was actually wondering,
what was that?
I did want to show one thing for everyone who might be watching this, and Chris, is it's such an issue that you can go online to, if you look up a website called Celestrak Socrates, you can actually find out 3 times a day. Hang on, can I share my screen?
Should be able to, Matt.
Oh, there it is. If I share this, you can go onto this website here, Celestrak Socrates, and you can look up all the nearest collisions that are going to happen in the next week. So there's obviously 4 here that have relative velocity of 0. These are payloads and their objects. So NASA DART was obviously launched recently on a Falcon 9. But when you start coming down here, you can see that Space B62 is going to collide with Zhuhai sometime December 1st. Well, potentially collide, I should say. It's not a given. And you can start looking at the risk, which is currently at 12.3% chance for collision. Now, for reference, for people who aren't in the know, the NASA guideline says if you're within a 1 in 10,000 chance of a collision, you should move. So this is a very clear example of these two are going to have to discuss and someone is going to have to move, because the 12% chance to risk is ridiculously high. That's a very dangerous approach they've got there. They're going to get within
Roll
5
dice.
meters of each other.
Yeah, like you roll an 8 side, and do you feel lucky?
Yeah. And that's the thing, is this is constantly changing. Like this updates 3 times a day. And you just see the top 10 that are going to happen in the next week. And this is, it's constant. It's something that is always going to be there. And it's something we have to deal with now, because at the moment, we've got a couple thousand active satellites in low Earth orbit, but that's going to change. That's going to get a lot bigger, a lot faster now. And we're going to have to do something about it.
Chris, any further questions?
No. That's really answered what I was interested in. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
No worries.
No trouble.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to actually talk about this stuff instead of just musing in one's armchair at the long hours of the night.
Yeah. All right. Well, should we give ourselves an early mark, guys? What do you want to do here?
I'm thinking so. I'd like to, thank my hosts. I'd like to thank Chris not only for his fine questions, but all the great work he has been doing for technical support for us and for other speakers. And I would like to thank anyone who might be watching this at some later time for their attention. And with that, I will
Thanks, Chris.
cease recording.
Sure. Bye.